let's talk about the Everyman Avenger, Thunderstrike, the other Thor. My name's Garcia, and for 10 years I worked for the official handbooks of the Marvel Universe, writing profiles for a lot of characters, including Thunderstrike, although not the original Thunderstrike, his son, but we'll talk about him next time. So who was Eric Masterson, the original Thunderstrike? It's kind of a tragic story, but it all starts when Thor was maintaining the secret identity of Sigurd Jarlsson. Could you imagine a big, bulky hero just putting on a pair of glasses and slicking their hair back and assuming no one would recognize them? As Sigurd, Thor was working a construction site where Eric was the architect, and this drew him into Thor's circle, and he often got attacked by Thor's villains, including Mongoose or Quicksand, who I also wrote about for the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. And while this threw Eric's life for a loop, it really entertained his young son, Kevin. The boy was young, he saw fifth graders as the big kids, and he really looked up to superheroes, especially Captain America. Yeah, but after meeting Thor himself, he switched allegiances. Of course, being friends with Thor means getting involved in Thor's fights, not just as a victim, but sometimes as a teammate. Yeah, despite being a normal human with no special fighting skills or abilities, Eric got drawn into several battles in space and other dimensions. So when faced with the Mongoose, who is way more dangerous than he sounds, and Thor seemed over his head, Eric couldn't just stand idly by. He had to step in. This meant doing something that up to that point, only two others had really done before, and that is prove he was worthy. Even Thor was surprised at first, thinking that the hammer's movement was due to his own call for it. But no, Eric was totally worthy. Too bad he didn't have those fighting skills I mentioned earlier. When the battle was over, Thor was determined not to let such a good man die, no matter the cost. He called on Odin to do whatever he could to give this man another chance. And Odin warned him there would be a cost. We can worry about that later, because in the next page we see Eric gets to come home to see his family, and he even introduced them to his friend, Harry Cleese. Yeah, some of these guys aren't great with their secret identities. Kevin was excited to see his dad, especially after he disappeared under mysterious circumstances, but more importantly, he had a cool new walking stick. And while Kevin didn't understand the significance, Eric and longtime comic book readers knew exactly what this meant. Because striking his walking stick on the ground would reveal what had saved Eric's life. He had merged body and soul with the mighty Thor. Eric kept this change a secret from Kevin and the rest of his family because the family was in a precarious position. Unlike a lot of other superheroes at the time, Eric was divorced. His ex-wife Marcy had custody of Kevin most of the time and was with a new guy, Bobby Steele, who was a professional player in the NFL. So that's a lot to live up to. And, well, he was worried that his new position would put Kevin in danger, and this happened as Kevin would get kidnapped by people like Loki. While Loki is a very different person today, this was the height of his God of Evil phase, and he was not above kidnapping a small child. It's almost like he was trying to get Thor angry. And even when the battle seemed over, Loki took one more shot, not at Thor, but at Masterson's friends and family. This was a rainbow bridge too far for the God of Thunder. Thor decided to take matters into his own hands and issue Loki capital punishment. Despite this, Thor said he would always remember Loki from happier times, and to his credit, Loki said, "I curse you with my dying breath." This act instantly sparked a reaction from the All-Father himself. Thor would be punished for his deeds, with his soul taken away and given to somebody who'd wanted it all these years. Yeah, Mephisto, for some reason. Eric said this wasn't fair. The world still needs heroes. So he struck his cane against the wall and realized he was now the mighty Thor. So yeah, the new status quo was going to be a human was the God of Thor for the first time in Marvel's history. Kind of a neat thing. And because he was an artist, an architect, remember, he decided to design his own costume. And not bad, really. I mean, what would you do if you were worthy of the hammer? And that worthiness was important because while Eric suffered from feelings of inadequacy, he knew the hammer believed in him. Unfortunately, Eric wasn't the only mortal around with an enchanted Asgardian weapon. Remember this guy? Well, Scourge the Executioner, maybe known to most people through the movie Ragnarok, was much more significant in the comics. For decades, he was just a flunky working for other Asgardian villains, but in his final moments, he proved himself to be a hero by defending Asgard against an army of the dead, eventually becoming one of them. Despite Scourge's change of heart, All of the evil deeds he'd done over the years had built up inside of his axe. When a mortal allowed themselves to become possessed by that evil, they became Blood Axe. And I wrote about this character for the Handbooks too. Although a self-styled hero of sorts, Blood Axe was a major threat. And unfortunately, way more than Eric could handle. And while Eric is talking about having a power drain at this point, even at full strength, Eric usually gets beat by Blood Axe. What was that power drain about anyway? It turns out Eric's transformation wasn't exactly as it seems. You see, you know how I said it looked like Loki was trying to goad Thor on? Turns out that's exactly what he was doing. It was all part of a complicated plot to get Thor to finally pull the trigger, allowing the god of mischief to secretly take Odin's place. Yes, exactly what happened in the movies. Eric was stunned, but soon helped free the real Odin, only to learn Thor's soul wasn't in a bag in hell, but was instead inside of him this whole time. He might not have been responsible for all his heroics as Thor. It might have been the real Thor. For a guy with inadequacy issues, this is a big deal. Of course, all this is happening as Eric's life is falling apart and his family is moving farther and farther away. Cue the obligatory 90s Ren and Stimpy reference. Personal problems aside, Eric went on a journey into his own soul to bring back the original Thor. And the Odinson was so happy that he decided to let Eric keep using Mjolnir for a while, allowing there to be two Thors. Because while the ability to be Thor is within Thor himself, anyone worthy of the hammer can also be Thor. But naturally, this didn't last very long. Eventually, Eric returned Mjolnir to Thor, and Thor gave him a parting gift. Another walking stick? He wouldn't. Would he? Yeah, he did. Eric now had his own weapon, not a hammer, but a mace, and it came with its own instructions, sort of. Instead of requiring worthiness, it just said that the world needs heroes, and that's Eric. And we finally get to where Eric Masterson becomes Thunderstrike. But this video's gone on too long, so let's deal with this and the tragic ending next time. How did a middle-aged divorced dad become Thor and then become his own superhero? Let's talk about Thunderstrike. Last time we talked about how Thor used to wear glasses and pretend to be a normal person thinking no one would notice. And this is when he met Eric Masterson and his son Kevin. Through a series of wacky shenanigans, Eric eventually became the new Thor, something that weighed heavily on him as he felt he shouldn't have been given this role. He was just a normal person, no special skills, no special powers, just asked to be the new Thunder God. This was particularly difficult because Eric was going through a messy divorce and barely had the chance to see his son Kevin. His ex-wife Marcy was busy opening up popular businesses, and her new husband Bobby Steele was a moderately successful professional football player who came with a lot of baggage, but we'll get back to that. So now Eric had to juggle his old life with his new superhero life. It helped that he had new superhero buddies, but sometimes they were more trouble than they were worth. But after his tenure as Thor was over, he was given a gift, a magical mace called Thunderstrike. And he decided to put his artistic skills to use, designing a new costume. It wasn't bad, but it was very, very 90s. He's got a ponytail, he's got an earring, he's got these open sidearm areas, he's got partially fingerless gloves and random chains. It's hard to believe this could get any more 90s. And yet somehow it got way more 90s. Way, way more 90s. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Eric hoped to set himself apart from Thor by defining his Thunderstrike identity, and he did this by fighting enemies like Blood Axe, and let's be honest, he didn't always fare that well. But with new enemies, there were new allies. Stellaris has a suit of adjustable armor strong enough to take out Celestials. That makes this character one of the most powerful heroes at Marvel. But other than wanting to take out Celestials, she doesn't know anything about her past, so she turned to Blondie, Eric, for help. Thankfully, her nigh invulnerable armor could be retooled into whatever she wanted to blend in, because she really wanted to blend in with Eric. Not that Eric really noticed. He saw her as a nuisance and definitely trouble. He was busy thinking about other people. Meanwhile, Kevin was definitely impressed by her. And using the alias Leia Princess, get it? She was impressed by the way Eric took care of Kevin. But Eric only had eyes for Jackie Lucas, who was his old rival as an architect, and he thought someday she'd be the death of him. Eric also struggled with his estranged family, especially Bobby Steele, for all the good it did him. But with Thor-like powers, he could get his revenge by flooding Bobby's car. And while I'm being flippant, I want to point out that this was actually the start of a very serious story. See, writer Tom DeFalco had actually been trying to put more realistic domestic situations in a lot of the comics he was writing at the time, and as a reader, I felt like a lot of them didn't always fit, but they worked really well in Thunderstrike, where there were some dark situations that were handled with, well, they were complicated. For example, Bobby was somebody who probably used steroids and was definitely abused as a child, and he took this out in the form of anger at least once against his wife. And twice he took his stepson without permission. Yeah, that's kidnapping, but the family tried to forgive him, and more importantly, Kevin understood that there was a lot more going on beneath the surface. Now, this is not to excuse his behavior, but Bobby was going through some stuff. Not that that should matter to Eric, because no one should mess with his son. But here's where all that complication comes in, because Kevin said, yeah, this guy did bad stuff, but he needs help. And he agreed to get it. Bobby has since gone to therapy, and he seems to be doing better. It really didn't help that Eric was allowing his secret identity as a superhero to get between him and his son, as he refused to tell Kevin or anyone else about what was happening. Kevin was, rough estimate, about 10 here, but he knew his dad was a superhero. He was just waiting for his dad to admit it. Things got worse after a lucky break allowed Eric to get the blood axe from his enemy. This was an Asgardian weapon once used by Scourge the Executioner, who died in battle defending Asgard. Although Scourge was a better person at the moment of his death, he'd done a lot of evil things over the years, and all of those things built up inside the axe. Eric hoped to keep the axe out of the wrong hands, but he also knew the power it possessed and how it would help him become a stronger hero, as he knew that he wasn't able to live up to Thor, but he also knew that the longer he had it in his possession, the more tempting it was to use it. And when he battled Seth, a dark god with power to rival that of Odin, he knew he needed more strength, so he got it from the blood axe. This increased his power enough to overcome Seth, but now he wanted more. Deep inside, Eric wanted to stop this rampage before it hurt Kevin or anyone else he loved. He begged his friends to put an end to the violence that was inside him. Ultimately, this was a battle that could only be fought by himself. And Eric won that war. But at what cost? Yeah, this is one of the few comics to end with the hero's death. And more significantly, it's one of the few heroes' deaths in the Marvel Universe that is stuck. I mean, yeah, his body's been brought back a couple times, and his spirit's been brought back once or twice, but mostly Eric has stayed dead, which is hard to do in the Marvel Universe. He was offered a place in Valhalla where he could have partied on in eternity with his friends, the Asgardians, and let's be blunt, if he was in Valhalla, he probably could have gotten out at one point. But instead, he chose to go to the Christian heaven, and this is something that Odin helped him do. If you're curious how all this works, I did an entire video about the way the afterlife works in Marvel. His family honored him, although they always knew he was hiding something. And Kevin calling Bobby dad has got a sting from beyond the grave. But Thor knew that Eric couldn't just be forgotten. His legacy was too important. And the world still needs heroes. And there'd be a point in which the world would get the hero it needs. Next time, we need to talk about Kevin. If your dad died as a superhero, would you want to follow in his footsteps? Let's talk about Kevin Masterson, the second Thunderstrike. My name's Garcia, and for 10 years I wrote for the official Handbooks of the Marvel Universe, writing profiles on a lot of characters, including the younger Thunderstrike. Kevin's story really begins when his dad, Eric Masterson, met Thor. Growing up in New York City, Kevin was a big fan of superheroes, especially Captain America. But when he met the disguised Thor, he was surprised to find out that this giant blonde guy was actually a few inches taller than Captain America. Seeing as he saw fifth graders as the big kids, Kevin was probably about 10 at this point and not too old to dress up his favorite heroes. But he was old enough to know when his heroes needed help. When a mortal possessed by the Asgardian blood axe attacked Thor, Kevin jumped in with his hammer! Of course, it was just a toy, so it really didn't do him any good. Nevertheless, Thor was impressed by his bravery. When the battle was over, Thor blessed Kevin, declaring him to be a true hammer bearer. That means that even as an adolescent, he was already joining the ranks of people like Beta Ray Bill and Steve Rogers. Not that he knew what this meant, as he would still worry about Thor whenever he was out, and even more so when his father was out on adventures with Thor. Once, when Eric was missing, Kevin ran off to his room. He prayed, hoping there was some way to reach Thor, all the while holding on tight to that toy hammer. You see, whenever a hammer bearer holds a hammer, whether it's made of uru or plastic, and asks for help, other hammer bearers will sense his plight and rush to aid. Thor assured Kevin that he'd always be there to help his father, something that got a lot more complicated when Eric became Thunderstrike. And Kevin's life was complicated. There were issues of domestic violence at home between his mother and his stepdad, a professional football player, and issues with his own dad, who was keeping secrets from him and not around much as his mother had main custody. Then it got worse when there was a chance the whole family was going to be split up and he'd have to move across the country. He said, if only there was some way I could make a deal that would not have this happen. And somebody offered him a deal. Yeah, if Mephisto can get involved, Mephisto's going to get involved. Shortly before the move, Kevin was injured. And wouldn't you know it, somebody was there to offer help. Mephisto had loftier goals than just Kevin. He wanted Thunderstrike or Thor, and he had a signed contract to boot. But this is where getting greedy got him in trouble, because once he decided he wanted Thor as well, there were other people that had claims on that soul. And while all that was happening, a man with a fluffy white beard who always knows if you've been naughty or nice visited Kevin's hospital room. That's right, Odin decided to save Kevin's life. Mephisto said that all claims were off and that he didn't need the boy anymore, but the thing is, what Kevin wanted came true. Technically, his family didn't get split up, because not long after this, Eric died. Eric, as Thunderstrike, gave up his life rather than risk the people of New York facing the wrath of the Blood Axe, and removed himself from Kevin's life. And now for the time skip. So Kevin was probably about 10 when his father died, and this was a comic published in the early 90s. Jump ahead to 2011, Marvel timescale, Kevin's probably about 16. And it's a rough 16. Despite having a lot of potential, Kevin often got into fights and ignored a lot of his studies, especially, ironically, mythology. Who'd have thought? But when Steve Rogers became in charge of the nation's superheroes and he realized that the government still had custody of the Thunderstrike mace, he gave it to Kevin. But it didn't have power at first. Maybe he should have said Shazam. Regardless, he accepted the mace and took it home, and when Steve offered to have him trained to be a hero, Kevin said he wanted nothing to do with it. I mean, that's literally what killed his dad. Why would he want to do that too? But the mace itself says the world still needs heroes. So when innocent people were at risk and all he had handy was the mace, he used it and became Thunderstrike, like the original Thunderstrike. How weird would it be to suddenly be your dead dad? Unlike a lot of teen superheroes, he immediately told his parents what happened because, honestly, haven't they been through enough? Little did he know a Valkyrie in training named Grunhilde was being sent just to train him. To say he liked the idea of getting special attention from her is putting it mildly. He is a teenager after all. So when bad guys attacked, he followed her instructions and became his dad again. He decided to call her Grunny instead of Grunhilde, and she decided to call him Mort, short for mortal. Kevin had previously said that he thought his dad's costume looked weird. I mean, that's aside from the weirdness of becoming his dead dad. Grunny said, enchanted Asgardian weapons are literally magic, so not only can they change your appearance, they can change your appearance to whatever you want. I mean, it's basically Sailor Moon's pin. He can become anything and turn the mace into anything. And since Kevin plays a lot of video games, he figured he should look like a bruiser. Yeah, not only does he not study mythology, he also wasn't the artist that his dad was, though he was just as good of a fighter. Fortunately, changing forms between his human shape and his Asgardian shape automatically heals the other shape, so useful. He can also throw the mace and have it return to his hand, but if it's ever missing, sense where it has gone. And unlike a lot of first-time heroes, Kevin knew how to learn from the mistakes of others. So when presented with an enemy way more powerful than himself, I mean, this is Mangog, he regularly fights Odin. He knew he had a choice. He could either run and hide and never have to deal with this again, or become the kind of hero that ended his father's life. But he knew that if he was going to do this, he needed help. So he redesigned his costume to something a little bit more practical and called on all of New York's heroes for backup, including Thor, the guy that he kind of blames for his dad's death. You see, while his dad's friend Hercules dropped by often, the family knew him as Harry Cleese, Thor didn't show up much, but he did watch Kevin from afar. And eventually they buried the hatchet, allowing Kevin to become a hero. Weirdly, they added this whole bit where his stepdad got a concussion, making him forget that Kevin was Thunderstrike, and then the stepdad would proceed to gaslight his mom, making her also question whether he was Thunderstrike, but let's just put that aside because eventually Kevin joined the Avengers Academy and that would have required parent approval, so they know he's Thunderstrike. Though Kevin does maintain a secret identity, turning the mace not to an old walking stick, but a tiny charm. Eventually, Kevin seemed to come to terms with his lot in life. He lost his father young, his surrogate father, Thor, just kind of skipped out of the picture, and his stepdad is kind of messed up. But he knew that he was made to be a hero, even if that could mean a short life. And then Kevin found what is probably the oddest choice he could have made for a father figure when he joined the Asgardians of the Galaxy alongside Throg and others, and that is Scourge, the Executioner. This is the guy that empowered the Blood Axe that killed Kevin's father. But Kevin doesn't seem to know that. The closest we get to a resolution on this is Scourge saying that he knew Eric, sort of, and that he would guide Kevin until Scourge got killed again because comic books. In appearance, he was seen in his own apartment. If he was 10 when he first appeared, he might be about 19 now, even with the Marvel sliding timescale. So it kind of makes sense that he'd want to get out of his house as soon as possible. So once again, Kevin's on his